Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm again joined by Keith Preston for episode 43 of the Casual Stream, where we're going to talk about the English Civil War from the perspective of class. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. And you can support me on Locals, Substack, and Buy Me a Coffee and Subscribestar. So, yeah, one of the things that I've noticed, Keith, lately is you've been doing a lot of videos or a lot of tweets on class analysis of modern day America. And you have your own position, which is indebted to Marxism and anarchism, but also where you differ from them in certain areas where you see them falling short. And I think that I substantially agree with a lot of the analysis you have. But I think the English Civil War is interesting in the sense that it's the first, I guess you could say, modern revolution, in the sense that we have ideas like liberty and taxation without representation and all of that stuff. We have, and then these new ideas popping up like the diggers and the levelers. And I think a lot of people who look at it from a class perspective sort of, I think, either oversimplify things. So let's look at a Marxist, for example, right? They're going to look at this and they're going to view this is sort of like and it's not entirely wrong. The sort of merchant or the budding bourgeoisie class is rising up against the feudal aristocracy, and they're going to view it within that context. Some socialists, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, view the diggers as revolutionaries, and even some of them might even consider Cromwell as a revolutionary. But while that's true, what the Marxist is going to want to do is downplay the religious motivations of many of the people involved, not just the Puritans, but also the Scots and the Royalists. And so I think that's one of the main weaknesses of a Marxist interpretation of this. The English Civil War is broadly, there's technically three civil wars between 1642 and 1651, also called the War of the Three Kingdoms, which is England, Scotland, and Wales. The way I would look at it briefly, just to sketch the actors, right? The Royalists represent the sort of feudal elites, which are the landed gentry, and to some extent from the landed gentry, this martial class, which is inherited from the Middle Ages with the knights and feudal lords who not only own the land, but are also sort of the muscle for the crown. Then you do have the rising bourgeoisie with the City of London. And the Bank of London, I don't think exists yet, but the City of London does. And what we might call the petite bourgeoisie, which are the craftsmen, which include the Puritans, the levelers, and the diggers. And we could say the revolutionary leader himself, Oliver Cromwell. But I think what's interesting, what you would often miss, and what I want to kind of focus on here is the sort of modern day petite bourgeoisie are very pro-market, pro-capitalist, especially in the United States. In England, that wasn't true, right? Because even up until the 19th century, the Luddites were opposed to industrialization. And the Cromwellian protectorate was banning and prohibiting a lot of quote-unquote commercial activity because it was considered to be vice. So while they are technically the petite bourgeoisie, they're not motivated by the, quote, classic class interest of the petite bourgeoisie, in the sense that there's this strong religious presence, which I think a Marxist analysis often misses. And what is interesting with that, though, is that it doesn't really repeat itself. In 1688, we have a more classic petite bourgeoisie revolution in favor of the Parliament and the City of London. And also during the Second English Civil War, I think beginning after 1647, after the king is executed, the City of London flipped sides to be on the side of the Royalists in order to fight Cromwell. So the Puritans themselves are not necessarily, while they might have been created by that force, the bourgeoisie, the New Model Army gained a life of its own. And so I think there's a lot of interesting, complicated things we can look at, but that's my brief overview of class tensions and conflict in the English Civil War. What are some of your thoughts, Keith?
Yeah, well, I think the first point you raised is critically important because you're talking about how the Marxists tend to interpret all of these events through the lens of historical materialism. For those viewers who aren't entirely familiar with Marxism, Marxism has this theory that ideas are merely an outgrowth of material conditions. So whatever kinds of ideas are dominant in a particular society, whether it's culture, social norms, religion, philosophy, intellectual life, all these kinds of things. Ideas are merely an outgrowth of material circumstances. That is, how people make their living, what kind of natural environment they find themselves in, and things like that. Um, that's historical materialism. Now, most non Marxists don't believe in that. For example, some of the early critics of this, of Marxism, were thinkers like Max Weber, who said, wait a minute, how people think also shapes material conditions. And material conditions may shape thought, but thinking shapes culture, and culture shapes institutions, and institutions shape economics and things like that as well. So you can't reduce it all down to this single determinant. And that's one of the core criticisms of Marxism, is that they over rely on this economic determinist framework. Um, and if you look at the English Civil War, what you see is, as Todd said at the beginning, is that religious motivations are paramount to this particular Civil War. Because one thing that was particularly significant about the English Civil War is the way in which ideas about the relationship between religion and politics were developing. Like if we want to, like the Marxist historians, they tend to break down the history of civilizations or history of societies into material categories based on a mode, what they call a mode of production. And that they start with the hunter-gatherers, then there's the horticulturalist and pastoralist, then there's agriculture, and then there's industry. All right, and then agriculture goes through the feudal stage. It goes through you have the Asiatic mode of production. You've got feudalism, and then you have industrialization and capitalism. So they tend to see everything in terms of the rise and fall of economic systems. But you can also do a similar historical analysis where you divide history up into different epochs based on the dominant intellectual life. And that also influenced politics. For instance, in the ancient world, it was common, if not the norm, to revere the emperor as a godlike being. The ancient Egyptians, for example, believed that the pharaohs were descendants of the sun god Ra. In Rome, they had a cult of the emperor. I think that started with Caesar Augustus, but the idea of emperor worship, the state cult. As recently as 1945, you had a similar system in Japan. Also in traditional China, you had the idea of the mandate from heaven, this idea that the emperor is like a divine or divinely inspired being. So that kind of thinking was very commonplace in the ancient world. When the monotheist or Abrahamic or whatever you want to call them religions started to become dominant, Judaism. Well, I guess it goes back as far back as Zoroastrianism in Persia, but Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and some other minor monotheist traditions. In those religions, you only have one God, so you can't worship the emperor as a god. So what you start to see is the development of this idea of divine right of kings, is what it was called in European civilization, and Sharia is a similar concept, but in Islam. But you had this idea that was dominant in the Middle Ages of the divine right of kings, and that is, just like the Pope is appointed by God to be the ruler of the church, the king is appointed by God to be the ruler in the secular realm. Now, an obvious problem with that is, well, what if the king is incompetent? Does that mean God is incompetent, or does that mean that the king is simply a bad king and he shouldn't be king anymore? And more, you had people in the period leading up to the English Civil War saying, well, it's the latter. Right? The king is the problem, and if the king is incompetent or not a just ruler or whatever, then perhaps he shouldn't be there, which means perhaps we have the right to remove him. And this was a revolutionary concept. Like in the Middle Ages, the idea it was, you don't depose the king. The king rules by tradition, by heredity, and by divine right. It doesn't matter how bad he is. In fact, even today, I know people personally who are still divine right monarchists, and they still believe that. They say, no, you don't depose the king, no matter how bad he is. I would. That's not a commonplace view anymore, but there are still people that hold it. All right. So in the English Civil War, you started to see the development of ideas that no, the king has to be held to some kind of standards, and that doesn't mean they were abandoning the religious element. They were just saying, well, no, there's a higher religious authority which says that if the king is not doing what he's supposed to be doing, we can basically get rid of him. And they did that with King Charles. With King Charles I, was it the fifth or the first? It was one.
It was Charles I was the king during the English Civil War.
Okay, all right. So it was so Charles I. They actually put him on trial and executed him. All right, and that was a really radical thing for the time. It sent shivers through the monarchs all throughout Europe. They're like, what? The people revolted and put the king on trial and executed him for crimes against the people. What? Now, again, this was not the same thing as a modern secular idea of revolution. This wasn't the same thing quite yet as the American Revolution, the French Revolution. But there is this idea that there are standards beyond what any existing king decrees that the king is bound by, and that he ought to be held to. And if not, we can depose him. And a big part of what made the English Civil War happen was this incident where the king was put on trial and executed, and that, to a large degree, sets the ball in motion rolling for modern political philosophy to develop.
Yes. Now, there's a few, I think, interesting elements about the English Civil War that, Puritan Revolution, whatever you want to call it, that makes it different from where we're at now. And also where I highlight some of my disagreements with Marxist analysis. So as you said correctly, Keith, that they view ideas as the creation of material conditions. But one of the things that should be fairly obvious to anyone reading history is that if we look at the material conditions of the New England, say, of the Puritans of England, as the sort of, petite bourgeoisie, manufacturing class, if you will, their beliefs about religion and God were not shared by other Europeans of the same class, even other Protestants of the same class in other countries. So one, why is that, right? Well, because it's more than just class, which is more to just material conditions, which is imposing them. I think where material conditions are important is they impose what you can't do. Like, for example, you can't send a message around the world instantaneously in 1642 because there's no internet. So yeah, material conditions do impose costs on you, but they're not quite as determinative as I think the Marxists would want to say. And clearly, a narrow description of Puritan class interests and material conditions does not explain Puritan theology, right? You're not going to be able to explain Puritan theology, the idea concept, the coming from just the material conditions of their life. Second of all, England in the 17th century did not have an intelligentsia like we would associate with a modern day revolution. So an intelligentsia is usually college-educated thinkers, like scholars, academics, teachers, journalists, and literary writers, who are the result of the product of elite creation by academic institutions. Now, there were, of course, universities in England, but they were generally for the very wealthy, and the printing press did exist in England at this time. But again, it's not like, say, the philosophes of France or the revolutionaries in Russia. And so in this sense, it's a revolution which is more like classical and ancient norms. In many ways, Cromwell is kind of a Caesar figure. So in order to counter the rise of various parties in Rome, there were a sect of patricians that funded Julius Caesar, which they believed they could then use him to serve their interests. But once he becomes sort of self-governing and autonomous due to his conquest of Gaul, he then turns on his supporters. And now they're like, well, now we don't have anything to use against Julius Caesar, and he takes over Rome. And I think in a lot of regards, the city of London and the bourgeoisie thought that they could fight the king by raising the new model army. What they didn't understand was Cromwell, as a Caesarian figure, then wins the loyalty of the men and then uses that as a bludgeon against those who supported them. And the motive principle here, the people that are actually agitating against the king are not, again, they're not intellectuals. They're not advocating for some abstract technical philosophy, like, say, the socialists in Russia with a sense of communism. It's more like there's the sense of traditional English norms, which have been trampled on by the king. What is developed, or I don't think it's developed. I think it was inherited. The Norman yoke concept, the beginning in 1066, the Normans, this foreign element, took over England and stripped the English of their rights. Now, in modern times, it's been fashionable to debunk the idea of the Norman yoke. But at the end of the day, there were rights that Anglo-Saxons had before 1066 that they lost, and they had a hard time getting back. And rule by any foreign power is going to be perceived as a yoke. So that's part of it. That's sort of a return to... So rather than oriented to some new future that hasn't happened, the new socialist future, it's a return to old rights that were lost. To the extent that there was this element of the new, well, even that, the Puritans wanted to return to the Old Testament. So whether it's the Norman yoke, the old Anglo-Saxon traditions, or the Old Testament, it's a return to something old, not something new and untested, which is what the socialists would do. And the execution of the king, what's interesting here is, unlike both the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, which were seeking to supplant the monarchy with a radically different form of government, and objected to monarchy as such, Oliver Cromwell and the Parliament did not intrinsically object to monarchy, and in fact didn't intrinsically object to Charles. It was only after it became fairly clear that while in prison, Charles was just prevaricating, buying time to recruit French and Irish soldiers, that Cromwell and other elements of the more radical Puritans finally had enough. And they didn't really know what to do once they had the power, right? Normally, if you had like a Robespierre figure or a Lenin figure, they're going to go on a reign of terror. They're going to go do what they're going to do. One of the most famous royalist historians, Clarendon, who's writing in the late 17th, I think, early 18th century, writes that while of all the many faults of Cromwell, and this guy doesn't pull any punches, he says at the end of the section of his history on the Civil War that Cromwell wasn't a Machiavel or a Machiavellian in the sense that he was this, cold, power-hungry, calculating individual, but one who was motivated by principle, just the principles that Clarendon as a royalist opposed. And so he's not right. He's not a Lenin or a Robespierre who's just seeking to acquire power by any means. Even Cromwell's critics admit that. So this is like both the first modern revolution in a sense, but also the last of the old forms of revolution.
Yeah, well, in some ways, it's interesting to try to trace the origins of English Puritanism to the Reformation itself, which happened about a century or so earlier. Because if we look at the Protestant Reformation that begins with Martin Luther, on one hand, we see that Luther himself, he had religious concerns, and he thought that the church had become overly corrupt with the sale of indulgences and all the other things that were going on. So he became an outspoken critic of the church. But one thing that allowed Martin Luther to be successful was the fact that the German nobility got behind him and shielded him from retaliation by Rome. If that hadn't have been the case, he probably would have met the same fate as John Huss or someone like that. In fact, he almost did. But you had the German nobility that was opposed to the Italian papacy, or frequently in conflict with it at least. So they said, okay, yeah, this Luther guy, yeah, we could do something with him because he's saying that we don't really need to give homage to the papacy anymore. And then once that opens the door for more radical reforms, you get, after Luther, you get Calvinism. And then you get the Radical Reformation, the Anabaptist, and some of the other traditions that come out of the Radical Reformation. But I think one interesting thing about the Reformation is that because it happened on the European continent, it was always constrained in various ways by having to share space with the Catholic Church. And then also you had different Protestant sectarian groups that constrained each other in various ways. In England, about a century later, you see the Puritanism develop, and this is sort of a form of pure Calvinism or pure, you know, pure Protestantism, similar to what came out of the Reformation, but it's not being constrained in the same way that continental Protestantism was. So it's really a type of Calvinism or Protestantism that is able to thrive, I think, to a much larger degree. And as Todd said, religious motivations as well as socioeconomic motivations were important. I think that a lot of the religious thinking that came out of the English Revolution, in some ways, it can be compared to some of the thinking that comes out of the Islamic world in much more recent times. For example, if we look at the Iranian Revolution in 1979, now the Marxists interpret that revolution, the serious Marxists, as a socialist revolution against Western imperialism and capitalism. And to a large degree, it was. But to say that the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was just about anti-capitalism or just about anti-Americanism would be stupid. I mean, what about the role of Islam? What about the role of culture? What about the role of Persian history? All of that kind of stuff. And clearly, a lot of people who participated in that revolution, they were motivated by religion, not just anti-Americanism or anti-capitalism or anti-imperialism. And the same was true of the participants in the English Civil War. They were motivated by religious beliefs and that were derived from the Reformation. Of course, as we know, one thing that's interesting about the Reformation is that because they rejected the church hierarchy and the church authority, the idea was, well, where we're going to get our religious authority from? So they would either go directly to the Bible or they would look at the very early church, like the pre-Constantinian church, and say, well, how did they do it back then? And that really becomes their basis of authority. So like Todd said, they weren't saying they weren't anti-authoritarians in the sense of saying, well, we're going to erase history as it has been up until now, like the French revolutionaries and have year zero. Instead, they viewed themselves as more as restorationists. The idea, well, we're going to go back and find what was better in the past and what was right in the past, and we're going to do that and apply that now against some of the problems that we see. And that, I think, is really the essence of the Puritan movement. And it did have this roots in the petty bourgeois class. And I think that, that overlapped with the fact that the German nobility tended to back Martin Luther in the sense that, their religious interest and class interest converged in many ways. Right. So then that had the effect of reinforcing their commitment to their own ideas. And as far as Cromwell, one thing about Cromwell was innovative is that his model of military organization was one that was based on a meritocracy. Like in a traditional feudal army, your position in the army is based on your social status. So you become a commander because you are a hereditary aristocrat or whatever, and that entitles you to be a military leader. Even if you know nothing about military leadership, but the new model army was more of a meritocratic army where your position or your rank was based on your ability, which was a revolutionary concept for the time. Nowadays, it seems like common sense, but back then, that was not considered the norm because they had this very static idea of a stratified order where people inherit their position by heredity and by just by natural order, the natural order of things. So if someone was born into a position of leadership, well, that just meant that's where they were supposed to be. But when Cromwell said, well, wait a minute, what about actual fighting skills? We're going to base our army on that. That was highly innovative for its time, and I think that's really a key element. This innovative approach to military organization that Cromwell developed was key to his own success.
Yes. The a couple things for the religious background. So within England proper, the Reformation was more of a top-down event. Henry VIII publicly breaking with Rome, most famously, of course, over the issue of annulments, but there, of course, were other issues involved. Now, that led to the time there were two groups, of course, the Catholics that were still left that were unhappy about this. And then there were more radical Protestants, i.e. the Puritans, that thought the Anglicans didn't go far enough. And there was back and forth until Elizabeth. And then Elizabeth I comes up with this idea of a sort of compromise where, broadly speaking, the doctrine is Protestant and Reformed, but the visual outward appearance is Catholic. And so the radical Catholics weren't happy, but a lot of the lay people that were like, well, I'm used to this old way of worshiping, were kept more or less docile because that didn't change too much. And the Puritans weren't happy. But since the Puritans and the radical Catholics were two small groups, that more or less worked. And then, of course, the Protestants were, of course, better, or the Puritans were better organized and more literate, and the Catholics tended to be mostly in Ireland, though, of course, there were still English diehard Catholics. But that then creates this idea, well, you're foreigners. You're not really one of us. So it was easier for the Puritans to organize and gain traction. Illiteracy and pamphleteering was, of course, very important in their rise to power. And they basically argued that the Anglican Church did not go far enough in its Reformation. That, obviously, the practical worship, still having images and saints and other things like that. And that's where they got the idea of return for them to some sort of Old Testament norm. But what happens, though, is they create this space for even more radical thought. And the two most radical are the Diggers and the Levelers. What's interesting when even Marxists look at these people, this is a comment that Rothbard made. I think it was in the one-time debate that he had with Chomsky. Because remember, you said, Keith, that back in the day, Chomsky could only get published by libertarians. And so there was like a back and forth letter exchange with Chomsky and Rothbard about, of all places, Cambodia. So, of course, Chomsky looks pretty bad because he so badly misjudged Cambodia. But Rothbard said that these people that don't have land, because it's all owned by like these aristocratic landlords, they're not Marxists. They just don't like the fact that all the land is held by a few people. And so that seems, so on one hand, the Marxists will make that appeal to injustice or socialists in general. And it's okay, as far as it goes, that sounds plausible. But then they'll add this other layer of reading of their own internal critique and everything else. And it's like, I don't, that's less less intuitive. But the Diggers believed primarily that they were kind of like proto-communist, but only in the sense of common ownership of property, not in any sort of material dialectical sense. They believed that with the Normans, traditional common land, which had been owned by the people of England, had been gradually accumulated in the hands of a few nobles, and they wanted to have that reversed. The Levelers wanted a more equitable representation in Parliament, because I believe at the time, Parliament was weighted towards the landed gentry. They had more of a vote. Their vote counted for more. And, the property qualifications limited who could be in Parliament. And the Levelers are like, well, no, we do all this work. We keep the realm going. Where's our voice in the Parliament? And so the sort of political genius of Cromwell was that when he forms the New Model Army, so for example, the principle that the moral is the most important part of war goes back at least to Xenophon. The moral being this sort of like commitment and self-confidence to fight. So we see this with like Greek armies defeating Persian armies that massively outnumber them, because the Greeks have this moral decisiveness to them. And there is a saying that Cromwell is famous for. Let's see. Something to the effect that he would prefer a rusted-coated captain who knows what he fights for than a gentleman who is a gentleman and nothing else. The idea being that this moral motivation, this cohesion that comes from having a shared moral vision, gives them the decisive advantage. And so what ends up happening is a New Model Army becomes a hotbed for the Levelers, which culminates in the Putney debates of 1647. And what happens here is that we have a tension now, because the actual military leadership of the New Model Army, of course, Cromwell is the head, are basically lesser gentry. They don't really want to upend the entire social order. They just don't like that the king is disobeying Parliament and doing his own thing, starting wars he can't win. And so they try to like talk down the Levelers and be like, hold on, don't go that far, guys. That's a little too far. But the Levelers are able to push the Overton window such that by 1688, a little less than 40 years later, that's more or less what happens. Their ideas win. But it was a lag because, of course, there was the Restoration. Cromwell didn't have a plan for going forward after winning. And so this idea of having a highly motivated force based on a sense of religious identity, but also these new political ideas, turned the New Model Army into a hardened force. And to your point as well, before the New Model Army was formed, and I think it was 1644, both Parliament and the Royalists had the same sort of mentality of like an officer corps from the aristocratic class, informal militias recruited, county by county, and no side was able to score a knockout blow for two reasons. Mainly, one, the officer corps of the aristocratic class really wasn't very good. Prince Rupert tried twice, first at the Battle of Edge Hill in 1642, and then at the Battle of Naseby in 1645, after turning the parliamentarian flank, looted the baggage train rather than finishing the battle by attacking them from the rear, something that Cromwell didn't make the mistake of at Naseby. And the militia didn't really want to fight much beyond their county. So both sides are just kind of doing kabuki theater until Cromwell organizes the New Model Army. So as you mentioned, Keith, professionalism, the idea that you ought to actually know what you're doing, but you couple this also with the sense of the moral component, which is around this sort of new spiritual revival emanating from the Puritan tradition, which is going in ways that even some of the Puritans were not comfortable with. And then his own military genius as well. And that's why I think he's more of a Caesar figure.
The story of the levelers and the diggers is interesting because in many ways they were a prototype for some of your modern ideologies. The levelers in some ways were sort of a forerunner to classical liberals. The idea that, the general middle class should have representation in government and guaranteed rights and liberties and things like that against aristocratic privilege. That's very similar to the ideas that you later see in liberal thinkers like John Locke, and then, of course, the American Revolution and some of that. And the diggers are sort of proto-socialist or proto-communist. I guess they wouldn't have called themselves that, but they looked for inspiration in Christianity. But the reason they were called diggers was because they would actually go around and literally squat on land and start planting things and farming, and often it was land that wasn't even being used. But to the English nobility, this was considered a horrible thing. This was, they got the same reaction that our urban gentrification class has today to the presence of homeless encampments on the sidewalk and that kind of thing. They're like, no, get this out of here. Those two, a lot of your modern classical liberals and libertarians will often cite the levelers as forerunners to their own philosophy, and a lot of socialists and communists will cite the diggers as ancestors as well. But that does reflect the class element of the English Civil War, and because you start to see these other classes becoming more assertive. You start to see the merchant class, the petty bourgeoisie, the middle class. You start to see that becoming more self-assertive and demanding more parliamentary rights, and also you start to see the poor, the people on the bottom end, starting to become more self-assertive as well. Which was commonplace, which was not commonplace at all prior to that. I mean, the traditional elites gave no thought to common people. I mean, they viewed common people as rabble that had to be kept under control. Otherwise, you'd have chaos. And that was it. The question was, how do you do that? How do you keep the common people under control? Do you give them bread in circuses? Do you use brute repression? Do you teach them religious and civic values that hopefully they'll be inculcated by? And usually they used a mixture of those approaches. But I think that in many ways the rebellions that came out of the English Civil War are sort of a prototype for the modern revolutions, and in a way that you don't see during during times that are prior to that, because you do start to see these kinds of class-based insurgencies that, their particular intellectual framework may vary. They may be either Puritan oriented or some other Christian orientation, which everybody back then just about would have identified as a Christian of some type. So it fits in with this wider cultural framework. Just like today in the Middle East, every revolutionary group, except the communists, they tend to think of themselves as Islamic this or Islamic that. But it does open the door to what we think of as modern political philosophy and modern intellectual culture and modern political culture.
Yes. Also, too, is if you look at the struggle between the Parliament and the King, and then the New Model Army and the Royalists, this is an expression of a broader tension between the value of a single individual versus an organized body of men. So King versus Parliament, or in the feudal medieval sense, these knights, these cavaliers who were trained from birth to be fighters, versus we might call part-time soldiers, the New Model Army was a professional army, but they were recruited from historically non-military stock. And I think one of the interesting things here, the conceit of the sort of ancient or the ancien regime in these cases, is that because they had this sort of training from birth, that it conferred upon them some magical status. Livy, in his history of Rome, makes an interesting detour where he goes through what we might call the first example of alternative history, where he says, well, what if Alexander the Great had invaded Rome in the middle of the 4th century BC? And one of the things he uses this as a sort of thought experiment in order to make a distinction between individual genius and a organizational genius. So he points to the fact that Rome beat Hannibal, who was an individual genius, because they had organizational genius. And the organization trumps the individual. So even if you have maybe somewhat mediocre men, but they're in a superior organization, that creates a ratchet effect that compensates and is more difficult for a single genius to deal with. I think the English Civil War bears this out. Of course, there were no actual geniuses on the royalist side, and the parliamentarians had the genius in Cromwell. And of course, once he took power, he then defaulted to the rule of the one. But when you look at the New Model Army, the reason why these troops who were recruited from otherwise non-military backgrounds could defeat these guys over and over and over again was they were just better organized. I mean, organization trumps individuals, even individuals that have been trained to fight for a lifetime, because they're trained in the wrong kind of way of fighting. They're trained to fight as individuals rather than as a body. And as an organized body, you're always going to win. And the problem was, politically, this is something even Churchill points out in its history of the English-speaking peoples, even though England had this political crisis with Charles I, there was no real viable alternative to the rule of one man, which is why Cromwell defaulted to a military dictatorship. Any real alternative didn't really develop until 1688. And so it's this weird position in the sense that it's revolutionary in the sense that the Parliament and the Puritans are overthrowing the established order. But it's not revolutionary in the sense, like with the French and the Russian revolutions, that they already have in order a new social structure. They don't. And that's arguably why the Puritan Revolution fails. They don't have an alternative structure. It's almost that they thought we could kill the king and just kind of keep things the way it is. You can't. You've already called the bluff. The king is no longer this untouchable divine agent. But then you don't have anything to replace it with. So it kind of escalated into territory that they were not really qualified or ready to build a counter to. Now, in the American Revolution, there was already a well thought out system to replace the king's rule. In France and Russia, they had their own ideologies in order to do this, but the English didn't really have that. And I guess from the point of view of the royalists, broadly speaking, I guess you could say from a Marxist perspective, it's sort of like the bourgeoisie fighting for their rights to displace the landed gentry, the feudal lords. Broadly speaking, that's true enough as far as it goes. I mean, obviously, the way the Puritans have their religious focus that changes the direction of the way the revolution goes is difficult to account for under Marxist terms. But the start of the war, I think, can be, and they represented the feudal medieval society. In one sense, the idea of the divine right of kings was heavily popularized by James I, the first Stuart king of England, which itself was a reaction to the political crisis in England, right? So after the War of the Roses, a 30-year civil war, which led to the basic extinguishing of the line of the House Plantagenet. Some junior cadet branch from Wales under Henry VII took power, and he, through an iron fist, controlled England. So did Henry VIII and the rest of the Tudors. But then the Tudor line died out, and there's still this Elizabethan compromise going on. What do you do with the Catholics? What do you do with the Puritans? How do you maintain credible political power? Because ever since the end of the War of the Roses, England is still dealing with this challenge of credible political continuity. And James is in part using the idea of the divine right of kings as a way to buttress this. And of course, it badly backfires under his son Charles, because Charles is frankly completely incompetent. Much like Nicholas II, he was just the wrong man for the job. He just shouldn't have been king, but he was king. And so it's also the problem with the divine right of kings is you can sort of make it work if you have a strong, spirited leader. But if you have like a withering, dilettante who would, be more at home, in a hobby store, it's a little difficult to take that seriously. Right? If this is some conquering warlord who claims he's conquering, for the god of war, okay, that might sell. But some guy that collects postage stamps or something, that's not going to sell. People aren't going to believe that. And then you call the bluff.
Yeah, well, I've been talking a bit about how the English Civil War helped to shape modern political philosophy in the sense that it brought the idea of the divine right of kings under challenge. And it also, you had the emergence of tendencies like the levelers and the diggers that were more prototypes for modern ideologies. But there's another really important way in which the English Civil War influenced the development of modern political thought as well. And that was the impact it had on Hobbes, because Hobbes was an English philosopher and mathematician who actually lived through the English Civil War. And his attitude is, well, we can't have this. We can't have constant warfare between sectarian groups and royal houses and things like that, claiming legitimacy. This is chaos. So Hobbes was a highly influenced by Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher. And what was unique about Machiavelli is that, just like the Reformation happened about a little over a century before the English Civil War, Machiavelli came along about a century or so before Hobbes. Machiavelli was a Renaissance and Reformation era political theorist. But Machiavelli, the reason that he's considered the forerunner to modern political philosophy is because prior to Machiavelli, the idea was that virtue should guide political action. And you see this in classical philosophy and in medieval philosophy. In classical philosophy, you have the idea of the classical virtues and the idea that the ruler should seek to be a virtuous ruler. And of course, the Plato and Aristotle, they had their typologies of, like the monarch versus the tyrant and all of that. And all of that had to do with virtuous versus non-virtuous leaders or rulers. And once the Mediterranean world was Christianized, you had that transfer into Christian thought as well. Through Aquinas and thinkers like that, you see the same ideas, the idea that political rulers should strive to be virtuous leaders and rulers. But Machiavelli more or less dispensed with an idealist conception of politics and said, no, politics is just about maintaining power. The first thing you have to do is think about maintaining power, because if you don't do that, none of this other stuff matters. So that's Machiavelli. And what he was interested in is the context in which Machiavelli was actually writing was he was worried about the fact that there was so much disunity among the Italian city-states, and they were sitting ducks for some of their enemies, some of their surrounding countries. So he wanted Lorenzo de' Medici to unify the Italian city-states so they could successfully ward off their enemies. And you know, Machiavelli was very fawning on Lorenzo de' Medici, saying, you are the man to unify the Italians. But Hobbes came along a century later and picked up where Machiavelli left off, and he was motivated by some of the same concerns. Machiavelli wasn't motivated by the classical virtues or by the Christian virtues. He was motivated by the idea of simply wanting to unify the Italians. And Hobbes had a similar motivation in the sense that, we need to find a way in which we're going to have civil order in English society so that we don't have constant warfare between those who claim that they should be the ruler or those who claim that they have the right church doctrine or whatever. And that's really how modern political philosophy gets established, because Hobbes said, bottom line is there's got to be an absolute monarch, and the monarch has got to rule with absolute power in order to keep everybody in line and keep society from unraveling into chaos and civil war. And it's precisely the kinds of things that we're having at the time. So what we need is a Saddam Hussein-like figure who's going to, keep everybody, make everybody toe the line and keep a lid on all this kind of thing. Now, Hobbesian thought feeds into the development of classical liberalism, because the idea of the social contract that Hobbes developed through observing the English Civil War was that Hobbes had the idea, okay, if you want the benefits of living in civilization and you don't want to live in a state of nature, meaning total chaos or civil war, if you want to live in a civil society, then the other side of that is you have to obey the law. You have to obey the laws of society, whoever the ruler is, whether it's the Puritans, whether it's the Stuarts or whomever. So out of that comes this idea of an absolute monarchy. Now, later you have subsequent thinkers like John Locke who come along and say, well, wait a minute, we can't just have a ruler that has unlimited power either. That's going back to all the problems that the levelers and diggers were rebelling against. So there has to be some limits on the power of the ruler. And so Locke comes up with the idea of consent of the governed or natural rights and all these kinds of things. And then that feeds into the development of classical liberalism and on into various forms of modern political philosophy. But all of this begins with the English Civil War. I mean, many aspects of what we think of as modern government and modern institutions and modern political thought and modern economic thought comes out of the English Civil War and all the different sectarian tendencies and social classes that emerged during that time period. So it was a very, very pivotal event in history.
Yeah, the English Civil War is extremely important for the history of ideas and how it then developed. In his history of Britain, Simon Schama, the documentary series that he produced to go along with this book, stated that for many in England who heard the American colonists protesting no taxation without representation, echoes of the English Civil War were heard, and many English in Parliament did support the American Revolutionary cause, and in part, the American Revolution was as much a war of propaganda as it was on the battlefield, because you had to sort of signal to the sympathetic members of Parliament, hey, look, we want it. You want this war to end. We want this war to end. We're going to put the English, conservatives in a position where they can't really win. You can score political victories and then wrap this war up. And again, I think in part the American Revolution was successful because it was able to tap into these deep-seated English sentiments, which go back to, of course, the English Civil War, if not even earlier, because all of these sentiments are rooted in an understanding of Anglo-Saxon history with the Norman yoke. So it's a very, very deep tradition of Englishness, that goes back to the Middle Ages. But so I guess, Keith, to wrap all this up, what were your final thoughts?
Well, we see the same process repeated on multiple occasions in subsequent history, and American history is a good example, because if you look at the American Revolution, there's the American Revolution is somewhat similar to the levelers in the sense that there's this idea of, well, we deserve rights, apart from the decrees of the king, and no taxation without representation, and all of these kinds of things. It's very similar. And I suppose you could even say that something like Bacon's Rebellion, maybe Shays' Rebellion or the Whiskey Rebellion, maybe that's similar to the Diggers or something like that, the more of a lower class based rebellion. But there's also this tendency in the American Revolution to appeal to English tradition. In fact, they would, in the writings of some of the American revolutionaries, would appeal to their rights as Englishmen. And what they meant by that was the traditional common law rights of English people. In fact, there was a leading conservative thinker, Russell Kirk, in the mid 20th century, that argued that the American Revolution wasn't really a radical revolution. It was a conservative counter-revolution against the usurpations of King George III. Now, I don't agree with that interpretation of the American Revolution. I think it was a pretty radical revolution. It was a modern prototype for modern revolutions. But that was an argument that was made, and it is similar in certain ways, because revolutions will often seek to appeal to past times as a source of authority. They appeal to the past as a source of authority against an existing authority that is perceived to be illegitimate. I mentioned earlier a lot of the Islamic revolutions, or revolutionary organizations in the Middle East. That's what they will do. They will say, well, look, we're appealing to Islamic tradition, to Sharia, to Islamic history, or whatever. In fact, even some Marxist revolutions have framed their rhetoric in that way. The Sendero Luminoso in Peru, they used to say that they were actually just reviving the traditions of the Incas. They called themselves Inca Maoists. They claimed that the Inca civilization was an actual communist civilization. So the English Civil War really was a prototype for all of these kinds of things. I mean, if you want to look at modern events and political upheavals and revolutions and ideologies, there's some sort of prototype for most of that in the English Civil War.
Yeah, I'll just say that the English Civil War is, in one sense, simultaneously the first modern revolution and the last old style lowercase r revolution of just one ruler supplanting another ruler in a fashion where, like, Caesar didn't have an ideology. He just Caesar. He just wanted power. So that's all we got for today. Thank you, Keith. It's always a pleasure. This is Todd Lewis of the Players of Folly podcast, signing off.